The China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has received the ultimate seal of approval from International Monetary Fund Chief Christine Lagarde, saying her organization would be delighted to cooperate in the AIIB's activities. The UK, Germany, and France are on board, but there's one vocal opponent, and that's the Americans. Christian Whiton, former Bush State Department senior advisor, joins me with his thoughts. So tell me, why are Americans so threatened by this bank?
Well, the U.S. government has been of two minds on China, really for a long time, since the end of the Cold War, certainly since Tiananmen Square, where there's a component that's very concerned about China, the rise of China, China's military, and sort of the Wall Street side and the business side that would very much like to engage China. And you're seeing this in Obama administration that has good relations with Beijing, but also talks about pivoting military force. And this is a case where they've decided to draw a line. The Obama administration is a big fan of the international order as they see it.
That world order, very much Western-backed. Is that the real issue here? That perhaps we are seeing the cementing of Eastern influence in the world?
I think we have to wait and see what really materializes with the AIIB, because so far you have had a great deal of European interest and interest in spite of U.S. concern. But the question is where, what's really there so far? You've been able to sign up, these European governments have, without actually pledging money, to my knowledge, at least, without anything really specific, without any funding that's actually appropriated and ready to go. So far, the Chinese have put up money, but it's just sort of a question of what this will actually lead to, and if it really does compete with the World Bank and IMF, and if anyone really cares if it does.
I take the argument that there still is a lot to be determined, but let's look at Asian infrastructure investments as a whole, Christian, right? So let's talk about the prospect of having these investments done by the World Bank. The World Bank has not always been at the forefront of these developments. So who else is going to fund them? The Chinese.
That's right. The question is, of course, whether this really will enable them to do much. The Chinese have tended not to be magnanimous in economic development to the extent that they involve themselves and they actually give money or guarantee loans or other sorts of economic assistance. It's often for a political quid pro quo. They'll happily build a soccer stadium in Africa for a country that is willing to switch diplomatic relations from Taiwan to China. Infrastructure in Asia, of course, looking 25, 50 years down the road, it's tremendous growth, but there are real red flags in China in particular, and questions if is this really going to drive, for example, infrastructure in Indonesia, in the Philippines, or is this at the end of the day just for China's benefit?
But we can read into China's ambitions all we want, but we have to accept the reality that we're in, and that's China very much has the money to drive this growth. So why shouldn't China be at the helm, and why shouldn't Europe take advantage and support some of these infrastructure projects?
My view is that absolutely, that if it's really there, then why not? I mean, after all, the World Bank, the IMF, those are taxpayer dollars on the line, either for development or for bailouts and monetary reserves. So if China wants to compete with that and actually put up the money, it certainly does have resources, but it has a lot of problems, economic and political, on its hands. So I'm fine with that as a taxpayer and as someone who's been skeptical of that, sort of post-Breton leftovers that haven't performed terribly well.
Okay, well, of course, you have been in advisory roles at the senior level. If you could advise the incumbent government or the next one coming into power in the U.S., would you advise them to also jump on the bandwagon?
I would say we should just be blasé, basically see where it goes, see if it's really about more than just sort of a prestige project for China, see if it actually is helping other governments in the region or if it's coercing other governments in the region. The U.S. has been a very strong power in Asia, and virtually every government in Asia welcomes that except for China and Russia. So, we want that to continue, but I don't see this as an imminent threat. So I say just let it ride. Don't really raise objections because that sort of makes you look weak.
Political nexus-wise, are you concerned about what we're going to be seeing rise or already seeing rise as a result of the Europeans to back this bank?
I think what you see is that if Washington doesn't have its act together and doesn't clearly explain why something Beijing wants or does is wrong, then we shouldn't expect European governments to be any firmer against China or take a position that's hostile to China. If, however, we can make the argument For example, there was a discussion some years back about lifting the European arms embargo on sales to China that's been in place since the Tiananmen Square massacre. Then, frankly, we've had great success in bringing Europe along on those things. So I think it comes back to how strong of an argument you can make.
You're going to have an audience here that could potentially want to take advantage of some of these infrastructure projects moving forward through this bank. What stops do you think should be put in place to make sure that the interests of all parties involved are protected?
I think the key part is a strong role for the private sector and private capital. And I suspect that Europe would want that as well, not just contributing actual government funds to be spent at the direction of another government. But if you're building a new expressway in Indonesia or in China or a new dam or a new airport, the involvement of private capital, I think, is the best insurance that these are not just monuments that politicians build for themselves.